Good morning to those on the East Coast of the United States. Good afternoon to those possibly in Europe or Russia or elsewhere. This is the Kenan Institute's 5th event since the Wilson Center went virtual. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and delighted to say that we're still seeing in excess of 250 RSVPs for today's discussion. During these unusual times, I'm encouraged to see that so many people share our desire for timely and critical analysis of Russia and its neighbors. Discussions like today's are the reason the Wilson Center has been recognized as #1 in the world in regional expertise for the 3rd year in a row. Today, we're talking about U.S. Russian relations. When a Russian plane touched down in New York on April 1, full of medical equipment for the United States, something we desperately need, there was some confusion as to who was footing the bill. The ventilators, masks, and respirators were not a gift, but the U.S. reportedly paid a discounted price for them. What became clear to many, though, is that the delivery was a PR victory for the Kremlin. The outcome of President Trump's intervention in the Russian-Saudi oil price war was also a mixed bag. Last week, 23 countries made an unprecedented commitment to reducing the global oil supply by 13%. But the glut remains. And yesterday, U.S. oil prices fell below zero for the first time ever. Don't worry, you still have to pay for gas at the gas station. Meanwhile, Russia is becoming more and more enveloped in its own coronavirus crisis. In the past 2 days, its number of cases have soared by 10,000, with around 50,000 total. Vladimir Putin warned yesterday that the country still has not reached its peak. To help explain how the pandemic is shaping the U.S.-Russian relationship, we're joined by an excellent panel of experts phoning in from the U.S., Russia, and the U.K. They will be introduced by our very own Dr. Matt Rajansky, who is the unmatched director of the Kenan Institute. And right now, I'd like to welcome Matt to moderate this program. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Jane. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us virtually. It's a real pleasure to be able to continue to bring high-quality discussions like this one to all of you, and to do so in a timely fashion. I'm very grateful to Jane and my Wilson Center colleagues for making this possible, but in particular to our 3 speakers, which is a fantastic panel this time we have for you, really running the gamut from perspective from Russia and from the United States, as well as from Europe in the middle, on this question of the U.S.-Russia relationship amid the current crisis and perhaps looking beyond it as well. In addition to what Jane said, I would note that the U.S.-Russia relationship, it won't surprise anyone who hasn't been living under a rock for the last 5 years, is in very, very serious trouble. And it has been for that entire time. Arguably, the roots of that trouble go back even farther. But there were signs before this crisis that there may have been opportunities to stabilize and perhaps even improve the relationship. For instance, the impending 75th anniversary of the shared U.S. and Soviet victory in World War II was perhaps going to be an opportunity for a high-level U.S.-Russian meeting in person. That now, of course, will not take place. There was perhaps going to be an opportunity for the so-called P5 from the UN Security Council, which are also the world's major nuclear powers, to come together, perhaps to issue some kind of statement that would tamp down fears of a collapsing global arms control regime. And all of those things are now indefinitely postponed. And yet, in addition to what Jane mentioned, the Russian medical aid plane load that touched down in the United States, Presidents Trump and Putin have had an unprecedentedly frequent level of phone contact over the last several weeks. As far as we understand, principally about energy prices, and understandably so, given the situation that Jane described. And looking more broadly in history, amidst crises, and in particular in the aftermath of crises that have reached this kind of global scale, economic, political, and certainly security crises, it has historically, at least in the last century of human history, been Moscow and Washington that have played a central role in establishing the norms and rules that will govern the global system coming out of such crises. So I would pose the broad question for our panelists to consider, and they'll each open with their own take on the topic for today, which is what will be, if any, the U.S. and Russian roles in the post-crisis global order? Will they have the capacity? Will they have the desire? What will be their strategic goals? What will they seek? And what will be the relationship between the two? But I put that out there as sort of a broad background question. Now, I'm going to introduce each speaker before they offer a very brief 5 to 7 minute opening. And I want to remind everybody listening that you can ask questions in 3 different ways. You can email Kenan@wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet @Kenan Institute, or you can comment on the Kenan Institute's Facebook page, and we will see all those questions in real time, and they'll get to me within minutes. So we'll begin from St. Petersburg with my friend and colleague, Kenan Institute alumnus Ivan Kurilla. He's a professor of history and international relations at the European University in St. Petersburg. He's organized workshops, published articles, and edited volumes on the use of history, historical memory, and historical politics in Russia and the post-Soviet space. So Ivan, I didn't mean to steal your thunder by referencing history. I'm sure you'll correct the record, please.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Matt, and thank you for inviting me for this timely discussion. You know, I would start with suggesting to differentiate between several levels of this Russian-American changes or Russian-American relations in this time of big changes. And the level of interaction between President Trump and President Putin is definitely the most visible. We see these telephone calls, we hear the press conferences, and we study, we learn what they are discussing, and this is certainly oil and like gesture of the mutual help in the fighting coronavirus. But I would differentiate it or put it a little bit aside from the broader state of the Russian-American relations. And we all probably would agree that Russian-American relations is in a very bad shape for quite a long time already. And it's not only about the presidents, it's about the misunderstanding is because of the mutual jealous and because of the mutual mistrust. And this is something which can be changed because of the coronavirus. I think that this is, the epidemic, the pandemic actually changed a little bit already the way the ordinary Russians and ordinary Americans probably see the international relations as a whole. So I would say that we have, with all of this pandemic, we have kind of opportunity, maybe not a big one, but an opportunity to improve the Russian-American relations on the level of mutual understanding and mutual trust. And I would point out to domestic situation in Russia. You know that Russia entered this pandemic in the time of the domestic political crisis. When President Putin started to change the constitution, and actually led to very mixed response from the Russian population and from the elites in Russia. So Russia entered the epidemics in the midst of the political situation, which actually, as many analysts say, make Putin's power much less strong and much weaker, and much he made himself much more vulnerable. And so I would think that speaking about the post-coronavirus world, we can it's a good time to start thinking about the post-Putin Russia and post this regime Russia. Okay, maybe this is a wishful thinking for me as a person who is much critical to the current Russian regime, but I do think that the time of the current, or the regime which is in power in Russia for 20 years already, is coming to its end, and the coronavirus crisis may accelerate this slide down of this regime. So speaking about tomorrow, we speak not only about the new lines in the international relations, new lines between the governments, but also about the new Russia. And this is something we should consider when we are talking about this pandemic applying to Russia and applying to Russian role in American foreign policy.
Okay, great. I'll go next to Rajan Menon, who is the Ann and Bernard Spitzer Chair in International Relations at the Powell School at City College of New York, City University of New York. He's also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia. He has been a fellow at the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs, the New America Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, the Council on Foreign Relations, and of course, the Kenan Institute of the Wilson Center. So Raj, we're pleased to have you. Please, your perspective.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thank you for inviting me. I'll begin by saying that I rather doubt that the coronavirus itself will have much of an effect on how U.S. Russian relations unfold, because I think they have a kind of logic of their own. I don't think that's necessarily the view shared by all. You know this, Matt, that not long ago there was an exchange of phone calls between President Putin and President Trump, and there was a flurry of media speculation about whether this was a nefarious gambit by Mr. Putin, and so on. I think that was just so much heavy breathing, and it was more panic than analysis. But it is emblematic of how it's become very difficult to have a sane conversation about Russia in the wake of the Ukraine crisis and with the advent of President Trump. Having said that, I think that the issues that are on the table for the United States and Russia now will, whenever this pandemic cloud is lifted from our heads, still be there. So in no particular order, the issues that have to be dealt with by both sides, either as adversaries or as cooperating partners, are the Ukraine crisis. The Minsk agreement has yielded no agreement. I don't see anything down the line, but without any solution that is acceptable to Kiev and that Moscow is willing to accept as well, we will not come out of what some people have called the new Cold War. I don't particularly like the term, but let's go with it. The second are two nuclear flashpoints, one in Iran, now that the agreement with Iran in 2015, the JCPOA, has been defenestrated by Mr. Trump. How will that be handled by the United States? And are the United States and Russia going to be adversaries or partners? Then, of course, there's North Korea. What happens to the nuclear program there? If there's a breakout, how will the United States react? In the case of both Iran and North Korea, the US has a very strong interest, but so does Russia. Then there is the militarization of space, which hasn't gotten enough attention. To be very brief, what is happening is that a whole host of countries are developing anti-satellite weapons of a kinetic nature, a non-kinetic nature, cyber warfare, electronic. I don't have the time to go into these various categories. But this is a very dangerous thing, because in the event of a crisis, when countries expect war, if they believe that they're going to be blinded by the adversary, there's an enormous temptation to take some sort of preemptive action. And then there is the question of what happens after the New START treaty expires in February. If it is not extended by another 5 years, for the first time since 1972 or thereabouts, we will have no arms control regulating strategic nuclear arms competition between the United States and Russia. Now, if you add to that our departure from the INF and the possibility that new weapons such as hypersonic weapons will come online, that makes for a very bad mix. So to close this out, I think that the coronavirus has yet to play out full in Russia. I think it's going to get a lot worse. But no matter which way it plays out, when the dust settles, which we hope will be soon, I rather doubt that there will be much of a difference. And the two countries will have to pick up on the issues that I mentioned and perhaps some others.
Well, thank you, Raj. I think probably accurate, but certainly bleak. That said, it was bleak before we went into this crisis, so it may be cockeyed optimism to look for a silver lining now. Oksana, Oksana Antonenko will pick up the rear. She is calling in from London and is the director of Cambridge, sorry, director of the Global Risk Analysis at the Control Risks Group. She's also a global fellow with us at the Kenan Institute of the Wilson Center. She focuses on analyzing political and security risks for senior decision makers in private and public sectors, and her work focuses on Europe, including Russia, Turkey, and Central Asia, as well as Africa and the Middle East. Oksana, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Matt. I think between these two arguments that we just heard, between Ivan, who was a bit more optimistic about the future and the change possible, and Rajan, who was pessimistic, I mean, I think I come sort of somewhere in between, because I think clearly we're unlikely to see a major transformation of the relationship precisely for kind of structural challenges that Rajan had mentioned, and I will also speak a little bit about in my remarks. But I also think that COVID-19 pandemic is going to be so transformational, not only to the global health systems, but also, of course, to the global geopolitics, as well as for domestic politics in many countries around the world. So it is probably presumptuous of us to think that in any way the international politics are going to return to normal as we've seen it before the pre-COVID, although it is, of course, very early to say now how this transformation is going to take place. Indeed, we have seen a flurry of communication between Russia and the United States at the highest level. I think 5 phone calls were reported between President Putin and President Trump. Yes, we know very little actually from these phone calls what they were really about. There is not very much reading in the open domain that we can analyze, but from what we understand, not only the oil issues were discussed, but also, of course, the issues of strategic stability and arms control were very much on the agenda as well. So it is very interesting for me that the COVID pandemic playing out in both United States and Russia in sort of similar ways in many ways. Both President Trump and, of course, President Putin are finding themselves facing that pandemic in a very challenging political time for both of them. President Trump, of course, facing the elections in November, and President Putin were planning to conduct a referendum which would have given him an option of staying for another 2 terms in power, but this referendum has now been postponed till later on in the year. Secondly, of course, in both cases in Russia and the United States, we see the COVID situation deteriorating quite rapidly, and the population generally and political elites as well are increasingly mistrusting the capacity of the leadership to manage the situation well going forward. And of course, we see the tensions between the regional authorities, the regional governors, and the central authority, which of course in the United States is quite a normal democratic process, although perhaps not as smooth as it usually is. But in Russia, it is a very new development in the Russian domestic politics, where basically the role of governors until recently had been very much to remain loyal to President Putin and to be kind of part of this vertical of power. And we're now seeing increasingly a number of governors are taking the central role and playing the key role in providing this kind of response to COVID. And of course, that is transforming the politics in Russia and perhaps creating new potential legitimate leaders for the post-COVID era. So I think that's something to watch. And of course, in the United States, we're also going to see quite a major shift, I think, in domestic politics leading to the elections in November, where there is much more uncertainty about the outcome today than it was before COVID. The third issue, of course, is that both United States and Russia before the COVID pandemic have been quite skeptical about the global response to international issues, and really very much championed their sort of sovereignty and the preference for unilateral action and their own kind of approach to global politics. You know, and I think they both had to shift their priorities and now increasingly look for cooperation and global response, you know, not only within the context of the UN system and the World Health Organization, but also in OPEC Plus agreement, which we mentioned before, you know, where President Trump had played a very key role, something which the United States has never been supportive of, this kind of cartel agreements on managing the oil price had now changed quite dramatically, where Trump himself had played a key role of making that agreement happen just a few days ago. And of course, within G20, we also now see a flurry of activity around this, issue of managing the debt, sustainability, and coming up with a more global response. So again, quite interesting parallels here. And I think the final issue which I want to flag here is that to what extent we are going to see, some sort of change in the multilateral approach to, managing the key strategic issues going forward. In particular, of course, the arms control. And I here agree completely with Rajan that the issue of extension of, or most likely non-extension of the START treaty beyond February 2021 is really posing a fundamental challenge to the strategic stability and the global global nuclear safety and non-proliferation regime. So whether we're going to see, as a result of the current sort of changes in the global order, real momentum being built up towards multilateralizing the strategic arms control process, and that will depend to a large extent how the relationship between the United States and China is going to evolve. And of course, Russia is not the key player in this relationship, but could become quite important beneficiary if this relationship either going to improve dramatically and therefore multilateral arms control will be much more possible, or indeed deteriorate dramatically, where I think deterioration of the US-China relationship can offer a new opportunity for perhaps strengthening US-Russia dialogue. I will leave it here.
Thank you all very much. I think three clearly distinct takes on where we are with the current crisis, and just a few thoughts to my broader question about the future. And I think that's what I want to go to first. Let me say we've had some good questions come in already. Those who wish to ask, again, you can email kenan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet to @KenanInstitute, or comment on our Facebook page. But the way I want to approach this kind of big future question that each of you touched on in some degree is with the question of capacity. To some extent, it seems like the policies and the relationships that we have seen evolve over the past decade have been premised on a relatively shared understanding of capacity. That is to say, take Russia, China, and the United States, three principal actors on the global stage. They have all acknowledged up to now that the United States is the preponderant actor, is the most powerful actor economically, militarily, politically, diplomatically. Whether that remains the case coming out of the crisis, or whether the United States, power or not, relative behemoth or not, still has the capacity to exercise that power, to direct it, seems to me a question that is going to shape US policy and then the policy responses of Russia and China. But arguably for Russia as well, much of Russian policy has been premised on, for example, using energy as a coercive tool. Does that mean anything with an oil price that is, wherever it ends up, clearly in much lower territory than we have ever seen in the modern era? And similarly, premised on the idea that there really are no meaningful costs for Russia, that's not to say for others, but for Russia, to destabilizing Western democratic politics, to mucking around with the global system led by the United States as we've understood it to be, that there are only really benefits to be had. I mean, does Russia come out of this crisis convinced that all of that is still true and that these are still plausible approaches to the world? And then there's the China question, right? Which is, and I recognize none of us are making a detailed study of China's domestic order. The Kissinger Institute and the Asia program here at the Wilson Center do that and have had great events on it. But, fundamentally, does China come out of this crisis feeling its oats in every dimension, or does it come out somewhat chastened, at least with respect to relations with other major powers like the United States and Russia? So, I'd offer each of you a minute or two to take a swipe at that kind of big future question, and then I'm going to go to our list of questions from the audience. Who'd like to take a first stab?
I'll give it a shot.
Please, Raj.
Matt, so let me take the Russia slice of this because there isn't time to take the other two slices. I rather doubt that Russia will come out of this with more capacity. So at the moment, they have something like 47,800 infections, last night's figures, and what 405 deaths. But the coronavirus czar of Russia and the mayor of Moscow, Sobyanin, has already said that that is an undercount. And even President Putin has become more alarmist. Now, I will just remind you that on March 7th, Russia had 7 cases. At the end of March, it had below 600 cases. And now we're at 47,000. On April 12th, in one day, they reported 6,660 new cases. So if unemployment grows, and if this epidemic, which is now largely centered in the Moscow region, about 2/3 of the cases are in Moscow, spreads out, and it is, because we're already getting reports from Ekaterinburg, Bashkortostan, and the Komi Republic, this is going to take a very large toll on Russia's reserves. Now, they have very impressive reserves, about 660 billion, more than their public debt for the first time. They have a national wealth fund of about $150 billion, excuse me. But if you have the ranks of the Russian labor force becoming more and more unemployed, companies in trouble, with the oil prices having gone down. So Brent crude went from about 56 about 3 weeks ago to now about 26. You know better than I do that a very substantial portion of Russia's budget, about 40%, depends on oil revenues. So we, the United States, won't come out of this strong. So I'm not saying that's the case. China won't come out of it strong. Everybody will be depleted. But the argument that somehow Russia will be walking around with 7-league boots because it's remained relatively unscathed, I just don't buy it. I think the pandemic has not yet played out. I don't really trust the official numbers. I think when the spread goes out of Moscow to places that are much less equipped in terms of medical staff and hospital beds, the numbers are going to skyrocket. And with that, the economic costs.
Ron, I'm curious, do you see it the same way? Do you see, setting aside the regime strength, I mean, I think we got your sort of cockeyed optimism about that. Do you see Russia's capacity being dramatically weakened based on what is happening around you now, or is this going to be a story of Russian resiliency?
Okay, let me, can I? Yeah, thanks. You know, let me start a little bit with American side. You asked if American capacity is deteriorating or sliding down, and I would say, okay, this may be a paradoxical idea, but I think that American capacity is, not only with Trump, but for some decades already, is getting on the relative terms less and less. The United States is getting less and less powerful, both in militarily and economically. But paradoxically, it is not in the eyes of the Russian leadership. I mean, for Putin, the United States is and was and will be the most powerful country in the world. And most of the foreign policy Putin is planning and doing is a big chess game vis-a-vis the United States. He does not pay much attention to Europe. Okay, he pays attention to China, of course, but I guess that the United States is a major player for Russia. And getting back to American side, it looks like American capacity is perceived as deteriorating in the eyes, first of all, in the eyes of American allies, in the eyes of Europeans, in the eyes of those who had a long history of relying on American power to solve many security problems and economic problems, and now they are looking on the United States with some suspicion. And paradoxically, Russia, and probably in Trump's eyes, of course, I do not know what Trump is thinking about Russia or what Putin is thinking, but it looks like for Trump, improving the relations with Russia is a way to, to return American capacity. The return to the old system of international relations, okay, not to the Cold War as it was, but to something where Russia as a major adversary can make a deal with you, and that actually makes American importance in the world much more visible. And this is something that can be consider it as a way to return or at least return the perception of American capacity in the eyes of American allies. So this is my take on here.
Great point. Oksana, please.
Yes, okay. Well, I'll try to cover all three, but very quickly. So on the Russian side, I mean, I agree with Rajan that, you know, Russia is unlikely to come out of this crisis with a higher capacity. In fact, you know, I think if we look at the current trajectory where Russia is on the curve of the COVID cases, clearly it is on a similar trajectory as many of the major European countries that have suffered major consequences of the pandemic, like Italy and Spain. So we are likely to expect many more cases. And of course, I also agree that perhaps some of the data that we hear from Russia cannot be fully trusted, particularly outside of Moscow, and it is likely that this you know, health crisis is going to be very substantial for Russia. But I think it is also important that so far Russia has been very slow in coming up with very strong package of measures which can help and reassure its own you know, economy and its own, you know, businesses, even though it has this impressive currency reserve and welfare fund, but it has not put it to use. And I think perhaps the authorities and President Putin himself has underestimated the extent with which, you know, the speed with which the, you know, Russian economy is going to start feeling the heat from that. And of course, the collapse in oil price, which, you know, of course, the Urals are now selling well below Brent prices, you know, already below $20 and likely to go substantially lower in the months ahead as we continue to see very low oil demand. I think is going to really struggle to reassure the population, and we are likely to see, you know, deterioration in his approval ratings already. So I think his domestic capacity will be weakened. You know, it is also important to mention that his regional capacity is going to be weakened, because before this COVID epidemic, you know, we have seen some momentum behind at least the Eurasian Economic Union integration. There's been some cooperation going on, and now a lot of those gains really are being quickly dismantled. You know, we've seen a rapid deterioration in the relationship between Russia and Belarus. Of course, many of the Central Asian migrants who came to Russia as a result of the Eurasian Economic Union are now being left without healthcare, credible sort of support for their healthcare needs, and that is likely to deteriorate relationship with Central Asian states if those communities are going to be, you know, suffering from large impact of COVID cases. So the regional footprint will be weakened. And of course, globally as well. I mean, we have really not seen very clear policy from Russia of how to manage, you know, the consequences of the pandemic in its global response. I mean, Russia's decision to withdraw from the original OPEC Plus agreement, you know, on March 6th has been a major misjudgment. You know, something which Russia has to back off, had to back off from, you know, in a pretty humiliating retreat for President Putin, and then seek help from President Trump to find a new deal with the Saudis. On the US side, I agree with Ivan, although the credibility of the United States has been weakened in the eyes of the Europeans, there is no doubt about it. But the American democracy has this, you know, unique feature that it can actually reload itself, you know, once we have the elections and perhaps a new beginning. And there is at least a confidence that within the United States there will be, you know, capacity to manage many of those challenges, you know, within the political system, and most importantly within the financial capacity of United States to provide, you know, necessary support for businesses, and of course to mitigate a very high unemployment rates that we are seeing now in the United States. In China, however, I think China is going to come out of this crisis strongest. You know, it is already in the phase of recovery, although of course we cannot rule out the second wave. But so far we have not seen any credible indications that a massive second wave is likely. And you know, in China, of course, is going to see a major economic slowdown, but perhaps not, you know, a recession, and it will able to start recovery already in the second half of this year, as both Russia and United States are likely to remain in recession at that time. So to what extent China will be prepared to convert its economic sort of windfall from being the first one to enter recovery into then assuming a greater role in global governance. And here the issue of debt sustainability is particularly important because China is now holding an absolutely crucial role in ensuring that some of the African countries and indeed Central Asian countries who now owe an enormous amount of debt to China, partly as a result of the Belt and Road Initiative, are offered a credible and sustainable and long-term, debt relief offering from China. If China does not step up to the brink on that and continues to exert pressure, I think it can rapidly, lose credibility, and its own standing in the world is going to diminish.
Well, thank you, all three of you. There are no shortage of risks in the landscape for the capacity of all three major actors, and yet it does sound like in the land of the blind, the relative king, or at least the one with the most advantageous position, may be China. That said, I'm always reminded of Mark Twain's famous line, "Rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated," when people write off Russia's resiliency. That alliteration is always present in my mind. But let me pick up for a second with a question from Kenan from the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, who asks about Russia and China. What are the possible areas for their cooperation, in particular with the pervasive surveillance technology that we've seen in China, 5G infrastructure, much debated, and also in kind of responding to and countering the U.S. narrative response. Do you see much in the way of Russia-China opportunity, or does the distrust and the gap in interest between the two of them prevent such a future?
So the mistrust hasn't prevented them from cooperating. There are a variety of ways in which they do so. Russian arms sales to China, they've started declining significantly from about 2008, but they've picked up again with the sale of the Su-35 and the S-400. I don't know if it'll reach the levels that it did at its high point. So that's one. Second are the two pipelines, ESPO, which transmits crude oil, and Siberia, which transmits natural gas. Those are in place. However, the decline of prices and the contraction of the global economy will have a very, very significant effect. They will broadly, I think, view the world as one in which they want to prevent the United States from throwing its weight around. They've both made clear that they're not in favor of a unipolar world. But my fear about this, Matt, is that everybody is going to take a hit. The question is, who takes the least bad hit? And everyone, if all three countries, including Europe, are looking inward, are there things that are going to happen out there which would have been conceivably better managed had they had more capacity to look outward, that are going to be much more vexing? And as a result of the economic contraction, will the differences between them in dealing with these problems become much worse? I have to say, I'm not an economist on China, but I'm rather less optimistic about the Chinese economy. It is true that many of their fundamentals are looking good, but the growth numbers are not looking good by their own admission. But if you have effective demand plummeting in Europe, in the United States, in Southeast Asia, China has become more and more an export-driven economy. So it's like a scorpion in a bottle with 2 or 3 other scorpions. And so what happens out there cannot but affect China: supply chain interruptions, export declines, and so on. And the interesting thing about China is, we've seen this polity have, by their counting, about a 7 to 8% average growth rate since 1978. I don't know any economy that's replicated that in the modern era, but we've never seen the political system operate at, say, 4% growth or 3% growth. So we don't know. This is a stress test for all of us, for the United States, for China, for Russia, and they will all be tested in different ways. And at the end of it, what happens and who comes out on top or who comes out below, I think way early to say. I think what will happen is that all of them will have their capacity diminished, and all of them will be perforce forced to look inward, because there are huge problems to clean up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add just very quickly on this, just to say that, so far, China and Russia were able to manage some of the very delicate issues in their bilateral relationship, because initially when COVID cases initially started coming into Russia via China, and that is before, of course, the European flights, brought some of the COVID cases from Europe. But, initially the first cases were coming into Far East from China, and Russia closed down the borders. They managed to do that in a way which didn't damage the relationship. Now, of course, we see the cases traveling in the opposite direction. So the current upsurge in cases in China is really coming from many Chinese citizens who are returning from Russia to China. And here again, there is very delicate bilateral relationship that they had to manage. Rajan mentioned Power of Siberia. In fact, the Power of Siberia, which was opened just a few months ago by President Putin and President Xi, in a great pomp and ceremony, had to be suspended kind of officially for technical reasons, to kind of technical servicing, although it is very strange to see technical servicing just a few months after the launch. But in reality, it's because China is was no longer able and willing to purchase Russian gas in the current plummeting demand environment. And a similar situation is going to be with Russian oil. So we are going to see a lot of kind of expectations about the kind of a bringing the bilateral relationship more to the even keel by expanding the economic relationship, perhaps being, rolled back, and Russia becoming more and more dependent on China, particularly for technology, which is absolutely crucial now for, expanding the surveillance, which is likely to become a feature of all of our lives, but particularly, of course, in countries like Russia and China. And the more Russia is linked to China via the technology and the 5G, etc., the less and less Russia is capable to pursue its own ambition for the so-called sovereign internet, and becoming more and more clustered together with China. Because after COVID, it is clear that the world is going to be much more divided along the technology line. So Europeans will be much less willing to, import some of the Chinese technology, while Russia perhaps will be locked up with China much more, and therefore more distant from the West in a way.
Ivan, please.
I want to add something about the perceptions, and get back to COVID epidemic, because what we saw just weeks ago in the Russian public opinion, in the Russian discourse, was that, okay, Chinese example was a better one than European, because China was a authoritarian country that efficiently locked down everybody and get rid of the epidemic very quickly. But now we see how dramatically the situation and the public opinion is changing, because people say that they're lying, that it was not a real statistic, that China did not. And you see this upsurge of anti-Chinese mood in the Russian social networks. And that is actually the representation, I think, of the bigger fear of China coming to Russia in terms of Chinese ways of governance, all of this, digital concentration camp, as they call it, or as a Chinese influence in the politics. And that's something which actually COVID made all of this fear such much more spread and much more, I would say, legitimate in the eyes of the Russian public opinion. That we should not underestimate this public opinion, which is growing anti-Chinese right now. Thanks.
I just want to say, first of all, the audience has submitted some phenomenal questions. The tragedy of receiving all of them at once electronically is that it is even more frustrating to try to get all of them in. So what I'm going to do is bring it back to this core question of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia. There's a question from Susan Bauer, who's a legislative fellow in the office of Senator Chris Coons, who asks essentially, given that even if a major change in the relationship might not be in the offing, COVID provides at least an opportunity to marginally improve things, the opening that the crisis provides. In particular, given what Ivan said, is there some kind of opportunity in the offing for improved U.S.-Russia relations And related to that, and I would invite in particular Oksana and Raj to comment on these issues, are we likely to see any change in the policy from the US side with respect to sanctions and isolation? And are we likely to see any change in the Russian apparent ongoing hostile, low-intensity cyber campaign? So Ivan, I would go to you first. What does the opportunity look like? Can it go anywhere?
Well, I do think, we can mistrust or don't like President Putin or President Trump, but what we see that both presidents actually are eager to make the relations better. Okay, maybe for their personal political gains, but they are actually the major forces in this possible Russian-American rapprochement. And this is actually, I cannot rule out that even during the coronavirus outbreak or after it immediately, they will finally make a summit or sign some big treaty. I cannot even rule out the signing of a New START, which is, yeah, I agree that it's looking less and less possible, but still I could not 100% sure that it will not happen. And that's something that they both want to do for domestic political reasons, for improving their standing international or domestic. But again, this is an opportunity. And we see that Trump for more than 3 years already in office, continuously pushing this agenda of rapprochement with Russia. And Putin on his own way is trying to do that. And this is this rapprochement can be evaluated or assessed differently from aside from the question of the sanctions, because I think both sides understand that the sanctions is with us for years to come, and especially the sanctions which were announced by United States Congress. Like everybody in Russia remember Jackson Vanik, and everybody understand that the sanctions is for years and maybe decades. But they can put it aside and make some breakthroughs, at least PR breakthroughs, or maybe real ones in the strategic arms talks, or they make form a new agenda around the coronavirus, around the world health or world fighting the diseases. And this is something they probably will work together. And this is my thinking about the major driving force behind this possibility of Russian-American rapprochement and in the current situation. Of course, I'm not speaking now about the future Russia, like Russia after Putin, but again, with Putin and America with Trump can do something together.
Oksana?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think that no meaningful improvement in relationship really is possible until three main issues have to be addressed. The first one, of course, is Ukraine, something which Rajan mentioned. But clearly, yes, maybe one can be skeptical about the current sort of scope of very sort of wide scope of U.S. sanctions. But clearly, no sanctions will be changed unless we see some sort of progress on the Minsk agreements, but most importantly, more generally, in conflict in Donbass and settling the situation there. And so far, we have seen that this COVID crisis, unfortunately, have not really offered any opportunities for improvement there on the ground. But in fact, things are perhaps even set back a little bit because the kind of the momentum behind the Normandy process, which was there before the COVID pandemic, has really kind of died out, and we are not seeing very much progress towards improving this relationship and bringing some more momentum for Russia's involvement in this in Ukraine. The second issue, what Matt mentioned about the cyber, low-intensity cyber warfare, we do see, over the last couple of months, continuing increase in the number of cyber attacks originating from the Russian side, and that is of course not just the state actors, but perhaps non-state actors. But clearly this is something which is a big concern, not only for the United States, but for many European countries as well, and something which needs to be brought under control. And then the final issue, of course, is this whole issue of information warfare. And we, of course, as we approach the elections in the United States, I think the big question mark now, what role will Russia play here? Will Russia decide to kind of follow its experience from the midterm elections, where it's dialed down quite a lot its information interference in the US electoral process, or will it actually return back to the 2016 reality, where in a perhaps more divisive and more unstable environment in the United States, Russia will try to play a role, a negative role, something which of course is going to accelerate sanctions again. And this is something which needs to be thought through already now, because clearly it is an opportunity to move the relationship forward, but there is also an opportunity for this relationship to deteriorate again.
Raj?
So I take it the question was, does COVID provide an opportunity for the two to cooperate? I have a hard time.
And in particular, if the policies of the two sides, at least characteristic, sanctions and isolation from the US side, and then kind of low intensity, asymmetric destabilization from the Russian side, if you anticipate any change in those, I mean, you said the drivers won't change, but the tactics.
So yeah, I understand. So very quickly, I think COVID per se doesn't provide any opportunity for cooperation as a technical medical issue. If anything, what I see the world doing is engaging in zero-sum strategy. There's a blame game going on. The US intercepted some shipments of medical equipment that was supposed to go to Germany. Germany was upset. The EU is pulling apart at the seams on this particular issue. So I don't really see the kind of cooperation globally, and I don't expect it to replicate itself in the US-Russia relationship. On sanctions, I think in the midst of all this, the bandwidth of the administration, even if it wanted to lift sanctions, is not going to allow it. I don't see any enthusiasm in either party, Democratic or the GOP, for doing this. So I think that's a non-starter. It very much is connected to Ukraine. Mr. Putin would really dearly like to have the sanctions lifted, no matter that the Russians have done some workarounds. They've done some non-dollar trade with the Chinese. They've adapted in the area of agriculture. But every trip I take there, what I hear from friends I trust is that the sanctions are having a huge bite. The question is, since 2014 to the present, there's been no indication that the sanctions have made Russia's policy fundamentally shift in Ukraine. Will the pressure exerted by the COVID virus make them even more eager to get out from under sanctions? And if so, how far will their position move on the key issue of Ukraine? I don't know the answer, but that's something to watch very closely.
Great. Look, we have got just 5 minutes left, and as I understand, one of the disciplines of hosting Zoom events is that unlike live physical events, they actually cut you off. So what I'll try to do is, there are 3 more questions I want to get in, but maybe if each of you can take each one in a minute or so, then we'll finish just on time. The first is from Michael Waller, and I'd like to throw this to you, Ivan. He asks how you see the respective post-COVID narratives from the US and Russia, in particular the narrative of fault. Raj mentioned that. I think each of you in some way or other has mentioned that. Who started it, how effective the government response was, and how it should be viewed relative to the responses of other sides, and the sort of heroic or not narrative of citizens stepping up, local leaders, NGOs, etc. How do you see the two narratives in comparison? Mm-hmm. Very quickly, if you can.
A very interesting question. Yeah, I would say, well, it will depend. It will depend because the narrative usually constructed for political aims. And I would, one possibility is the narrative will be like unifying narrative, like the humankind or both Russia and the United States face the common enemy. It was like the Second World War when we fought against Nazi Germany, and now we are fought against COVID virus and all of this health problem. That's very possible narrative, and they already started to construct it. All of these planes flying from Moscow to New York and back. It's about that. It's about the common, common start of that. But if the political agenda of tomorrow will be different, if we'll get back to the mutual accusations and new type of a Cold War, it's maybe the possibility. I cannot rule out the possibility of the creation of narrative that all of this virus was artificially created, I don't know, somewhere in American laboratories or maybe Chinese laboratories, depending on who will be the major threat tomorrow. So I cannot rule out this conspiracy theory, promoted by, well, maybe not by Kremlin, but somebody influential and somebody is visible. So we'll see, but the narrative will be constructed out of tomorrow's agenda.
Great. Oksana, I want to ask you, since you focus on the post-Soviet space, Yevgeny Pregerman from the Minsk Dialogue in Belarus asks, how actively will the U.S. be engaged in the post-Soviet space after the pandemic? Do you think there's bandwidth for that?
Well, I think for the time being, clearly there will not be any bandwidth for anything, foreign policy related, in the United States, just as in many other countries around the world. But clearly, I agree here to some extent with Ivan that, the decision to engage and how to engage and when to engage will much depend on, who are we going to see in the White House, after November, and what kind of global agenda this person is going to set forward. If we're still going to see President Trump there, I think the legacy of the impeachment and the kind of impact that it had on him and his advisors perhaps will prevent him from taking a more active role, at least in relationship to Ukraine policy and perhaps in the former Soviet Union as well. If we're going to see a change in administration, perhaps we're going to see a new beginning. But for the time being, it is very hard to judge.
I'll end with you. A very pointed question from Cameron Johnson on Facebook. Have the benefits of Trump's first term outweighed the costs from the Kremlin's perspective? What do you think?
Well, I think they expected more, and that because of the baggage that he carries vis-a-vis Russia, he could not deliver it. Can I just say a word, man, on this post-Soviet space business?
Yes.
I find it humorous that the question is raised. It's a good question, but I think the toll here has been so devastating. 25 million people already filing for unemployment, highest unemployment rates since the Great Depression, projections that our economy would contract by a third. So I hope we focus on the present American space, not any post space anywhere else. And I think that will be the imperative of all of these countries.
Yeah, and I think people around the world, as much as Americans themselves, will be asking that question of what will be the American focus. But by the same token, they'll be asking it about China as well, and to some extent Russia. And you've all helped us with great insights into all of those perspectives. I'm very grateful to you, and I'm grateful to our audience, and I apologize to the many, many of you who had fantastic questions that I couldn't get to. This is all, as it is for all of us, still sort of new, and I'm sure we'll have another bite at the apple. So thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to Jane and the Wilson Center team for hosting, and thanks especially to our three speakers. So for now, signing off on Zoom. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.